Thank you for having me here as a guest, as a non-member of CODART. Before I begin, I really want to give a shout out to Susanna Lammers of the RKD, whose essential help was so wonderful and really helped my research progress as far as it did. So my talk today is not about Nazi misappropriation, but it's about striking down the possibility of eluded past. I really want to illustrate two important points. One is the essentialness of returning to provenances, even those that have been seemingly researched really thoroughly in the past, because provenance is never finished, and there's always something new to learn. Especially in the last 10, 15 years, there's just been this constant stream of newly available resources, and also resources that aren't necessarily published but are in archives, or are published but not in places where you think that you should look. The second point would be to raise the question of which names get added to the list of former owners, and specifically that's in regard to the women whose role in collecting decisions is really too often overlooked. As part of my job, I review the provenances of works that are undergoing immunity from seizure applications, and I find that this is actually a really good opportunity to revisit provenances, look for the gaps, and then try to fill in. And this was the case with Maarten van Heemskerck's The Rest on the Flight into Egypt last year. Reviewing it, I saw that it had some gaps, so I turned to a variety of sources to address the uncertainty over its whereabouts and the chain of ownership during the 1930s and 1940s. And while I'm still not finished, the information I came across really greatly reduces the likelihood of a troubled ownership history during those key decades. Oh, sorry, that's the painting. I thought I had it up. The painting entered the National Gallery in 1961 as a gift from the Samuel Crest Foundation, and when it did, it was attributed to Jan van Scorel. Previously, it had also been identified more generically as a Maria met dem kind, or a virgin and child. And beyond that, there's always a possibility of contending with different versions of an artwork. And in this case, we know both that Max Friedlander had referred to a seemingly exact replica of the painting that was actually on the art market here in Cologne in 1936. The whereabouts currently unknown. But moreover, the Musée Grobet-Labadie in Marseille has a version that they attribute to Scorel. And so while these did not present stumbling blocks to me in my research, I present them as kind of to show that even works that are really well known can have these things that you have to keep in mind, and that can make it really difficult as you're looking through records to ascertain whether you're actually finding the work that you're researching in the records, or if it might be something different. So this is the provenance that I started with. It's the same one that was published in the National Gallery's 1986 systematic catalogue of early Netherlandish painting, with the exception of the second footnote that was added a couple years ago. There had been World War II provenance research that was conducted on the painting in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which had turned up nothing concerning, but also had not added anything nothing new to the provenance. And as you can see here, our provenance starts first in the mid-19th century when it was in Germany with a family, and it descended through the family, the Viehwegs, until they sold it in 1930 in Berlin at Rudolf Lepke's Kunstauktionshaus. However, we didn't know who bought it, and the way that we write our provenances is kind of coded. A period between two names means that we don't know how it transferred from the one owner to the next. So in our provenance here, the next owner was someone named Antonio van Riedemann, who lived in Switzerland, a private collector. But our curatorial files said nothing about him. We didn't have his life dates, did not know who he was. The name had first appeared in an exhibition catalog in Utrecht in 1955 in the provenance of the painting, and that's how we incorporated it into our records. And then, so we didn't have any documentation indicating when and where he acquired it, or when it left his hands. And if you see the very next name, Frederick Mont, in New York, was the next, he was a dealer, but Frederick Mont is the anglicized name of Adolf Fritz Mondschein, who was the co-owner and director of the Galerie St. Lucas in Vienna until 1938. And after the Anschluss, he left as a person of Jewish heritage. He fled. He would have been, anyway, he left for New York, and he set up a new gallery with his new name. Mont was actually the name in the provenance that made me think I should take a closer look, because he was a major player in post-war dealing, mostly with old masters. And because we now know that some looted artworks had actually passed through his hands, and that some of his provenances in his invoices maybe are not to be completely trusted, then I wanted to look a little bit farther into this. He had a really large network of dealers that he worked with in the post-war period, and including some who had actually worked with the Nazis. So this is a fact sheet from Mont when he sold the painting in 1952 to the Crest Foundation, and it gives only the Viehweg collection in the provenance, not the Riedemanns, which is not unusual, but it's also something that you have to keep in mind of all of the missing information. So we had two gaps that we had to close. One was between the 1930 sale and whenever Riedemann had it, and then one was between when Riedemann had it and when Frederick Mont had it to sell in 1952. There are no known depositories of Mont's papers, so instead I decided to turn to the collector to see if we could find out any more information about him, and who he was, why, was he Swiss, was he an immigrant, and I actually found out quite a bit through a variety of sources, including Ancestry, which is really one of my go-to sources. I use it all the time. There's an amazing amount of information and documentation that is uploaded to Ancestry, sometimes by other users. And like, for example, the passenger arrival logs give a lot of information. So we actually had his name slightly wrong. His name was Anton von Riedemann. He was known as Tonio. He was German. He was a Catholic from one of the wealthiest families in Hamburg. His father was a business partner of John D. Rockefeller, and as such, he was actually much better documented than his son. And so I actually did a lot of research just looking into the father to figure out more about the family. Most of the family had moved to Switzerland in 1917 during the war in the wake of economic unrest and other unrest. Tonio was married to an American. Her name was Mary Howard, who went by May, and the couple lived in a villa in Megen outside of Lucerne, which you see here in the middle. It was called St. Charles Hall, and it exists today as a kind of event venue. And so amazingly, I looked into it, the institution that runs the venue back in 2012 self-published a promotional book about the villa's history, so I thought, well, maybe that might have a lot of good information, and it did. It had incredible amounts of information. There were only a few copies of it, but I got a copy from Switzerland. And there were a series of very small thumbnails of historic photographs of the interior that had never been published before 2012. And in one grainy thumbnail, I thought, well, that looks like the Heemskerck. And it was confirmed by a larger image that the author of the book very kindly sent to me. And while this photo is undated, it was taken when the Riedemanns owned the villa, which we know because the photo is still in the hands of the Riedemann heirs. So this was the first primary source we had to document their ownership. For me, the main revelation in the book was that Tonio Riedemann's role in our provenance was far less significant than that of his wife, who had not previously been mentioned. May Riedemann was, in fact, the force behind their collecting. She was the one who furnished the house after they purchased it in 1921, and she filled it with paintings, antiquities, tapestries, other treasures. Moreover, she was described as someone who really loved to go to important auctions, and that gave me a little hope, because the 1930 Viehweg auction was nothing if not important. It was front page in Die Kunstauktion, and this is the first of 3 articles that they wrote about it. And in the post-sale article, they didn't actually name the buyers, and the buyers are also not listed at all in the digitized copy of the catalog that's on the Heidelberg Library site. However, the RKD has 5 copies of this catalog. 4 of them are annotated, and 2 of them reveal the buyer, Frau T. von Redemann from St. Charles Hall. And if anybody of you might know, sometimes catalog annotations can contradict one another, so it's really nice to have one that confirms who it was. May von Redemann died in 1931, and her husband was apparently something of a recluse until his own death in 1941. So she died in 33. So he died in 41, so what happened to the work after that? There's no evidence there was ever an estate sale, but we now know that by 1947, the work was with the Galerie Fischer in Luzern, which is very close to St. Charles Hall. And this new information came about the Galerie Fischer came from 2 different sources, both of the RKD. The work had been exhibited at the Kunstmuseum in Basel in 1945 in an exhibition of Dutch paintings from Swiss private collections. And the RKD has a copy that was annotated by Hans Schneider, their first director, he also happened to be the curator of the exhibition. He had lived in Basel from 1941. We don't know when he annotated it, so I can't date it to 1945 based on that. However, the photograph on the right, is it on the right? Yes. On the right is the back of the photograph of the Heemskerck in the Friedlander archive, which was annotated by Friedlander to say Fischer, Luzern, 1947. So we can determine it was with the gallery at the latest by that date. This happened to be the year that the Redemanns sold the villa. It had sat unoccupied since Tonio's death. The Redemanns had no children, and many of the artworks apparently conveyed with the house, while others were distributed among the heirs. So no inventory of the collection was ever made, and there are actually no personal documents from the Redemanns that still exist apart from that series of photographs that had not been published until 2012. Did the heirs send the Heemskerck to Fischer at this time? Unfortunately, I haven't been able to get that information from the Fischer Gallery archives or to find out if Fischer sold it to Mont, which I actually suspect. For Americans, it's actually kind of tricky to get information from the Fischer archive because of the payment system, and so far that information I have not been able to get it. But given that the painting was in a Swiss private collection in 1945, as per the exhibition premise, and given that the Redemann family did not sell the villa and its contents until 1947, and with no indication that Tonio was ever selling anything before his death that I have found, it seems likely that the painting remained in Switzerland during the key years of 1933 to 1945, so that I feel that really shuts down this likelihood that after Tonio's death that somehow it got on the market and left Switzerland. With so many provenances, when complete documentation just isn't available, this is the type of informed conclusions that we have to come to based on the evidence at hand. I want to conclude by returning to the question of May Redemann's absence from the provenance. When compiling provenance of artworks, we often rely on older documents, such as invoices, that might exclude the wife of the person who is paying the bill, even if she was the one responsible for acquiring it. Or, for example, when a work is published as in a collection identified only by a last name, the default seems to have been that it was a reference to the male head of the family rather than perhaps the wife. And I've also come across cases where the wife was not named in a provenance, even though a work turned out to have been inherited through her family. And then there are the many cases where women are identified, but they're identified by their husband's name rather than their own. For example, this is a 1966 receipt for a Juan Gris painting in the National Gallery that gives the name of the previous owner as Mrs. Fritz Blumer, who was in fact a dealer who ran a gallery under her birth name of Jean Boucher. So, and Gris actually was one of her represented artists. She knew Gris. So that part of her identity is lost in such a document. Now, I will say the National Gallery has had a practice of, when we have the name of Mrs. So-and-so, we do try to seek out and find her name and add it, but sometimes those records are really hard to find, so we do have still a lot of provenances that just have the Mrs. Out of 9,000 constituent records for former private owners in the National Gallery's collection management database, fewer than 2,000 name either individual woman or a woman as part of a couple, and that includes all of the Mrs. John Smiths. This contrasts to the nearly 7,000 individual records for men alone, which is a lopsidedness that suggests that there's a real gap in our knowledge of ownership, and it's one that I keep in mind when I'm doing my own provenance research. I'm just constantly looking out, where are the women? Finally, in the new and improved provenance, I fleshed out a lot of the information about who the people were, but I've also included May van Riedeman as the first owner before her husband's name, inverting the convention of listing a husband first, because it was clear, given her role in bringing the work into their collection, that that is where she belonged. Thank you.